Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 8th live talk session in the series on sustainability terminology with a greener future. For those of you who haven't joined a live talks before, my name is Gabby. I'm the head of partnerships at Live, which is the voice of the UK's live music and entertainment business, representing thousands of businesses, artists and backstage workers. Our live talks programme is a series of free online workshops and talks which focus on everything from equality, diversity, inclusion, sustainability and well-being, and are aimed at making the UK live music industry a more inclusive and positive place to work. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white female with brown eyes, blonde tied back hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt, gold jewellery and my gold rimmed glasses. Before I hand over to Teresa from A Greener Future, I just need to go through a quick bit of housekeeping. Please note we are recording today's session to share online for those unable to join. If you would rather remain anonymous, please feel free to keep your camera turned off and change your Zoom name to anonymous. Please make sure your mic is muted throughout to avoid interference. If we have some time left at the end, we will open up the floor to questions, but please feel free to put any questions you have into the chat and we'll do our best to answer those throughout. A recording of today's session will be made available via the Live website, which I'll link into the chat, so please do share that to any colleagues, friends afterwards. And that's it from me. So huge thank you to Teresa for putting today's session together. Over to you, Teresa.
Thanks very much, Gabby, and hello to everybody who's joined us. I wonder if we can have the first slide. I'm director of A Greener Future, and I want to start just by telling you a little bit about where we're at, because it's been quite a momentous year for us at AGF, before I crack on with today's topic. So for those of you who perhaps don't know much about us, we focus on obviously sustainability and certification of where we started was festivals, music festivals, but now that's a lot broader, and we include venues. We include all sorts of different types of event, from sporting to horticultural to cultural events, through to the supply chain. So we have, over the 17 years that we've been in existence, we first started our certification in 2007, which was the first for festivals anywhere in the world. And over those years, we've expanded from festival certification to consultancy to training and accreditation even of university courses. So our whole business has grown exponentially, if you like, to the point where A Greener Festival, which is what we were called up until March this year, no longer really described what we were doing. So we've rebranded, we're now A Greener Future, which really tells us, I think, more about the ethos of the company and allows for a much broader business base in terms of the things that we do. So very exciting year for us, you know, and we move forward to a greener future, pardon the pun. Can I have the next slide? And just to say, over this time, over this 17 years, we have literally assessed, visited, worked with hundreds, if not now thousands, of different types of events, festivals, the supply chain, you name it. We have worked all over the world as well, in pretty much every continent around the world. So we are truly global as well. All right, well, before anything else, let's just crack on and get on with today's topic. Next slide. So I've noticed that there's a need to explain all the new, what I would call eco-terminology that's sort of suddenly inundated most of what we do these days. I've noticed it through talking to other people, where I've begun to realize they weren't actually clear about what they were talking about, seeing notices, seeing adverts, reading articles. So I put this session together. I've called it Racing to Net Zero, to just really compound the impetus that we have got to get on with this, and we've got to move. But really, that's all based on the fact that we understand what it is we're trying to do. And that starts with understanding the language that we're using around this whole topic. And just to illustrate my point, I was doing some training earlier this year, and I stepped out for some lunch and came across this. Can I have the next slide? Award-winning carbon neutral coffee. Now, it's just one illustration of the way that some of this terminology is used and that you just come across, actually, and I come across quite a lot of it, probably because I'm looking for it now. But what does that actually mean? I actually went into this cafe and had a cup of award-winning carbon neutral coffee, and it was really quite nice, but it didn't tell me what they thought it meant, or what really perhaps they didn't quite understand when they're using that term carbon neutral, what the implications are. Can I have the next slide? But one band who did understand the implications of the term carbon neutral quite early on were Coldplay. And it's something I noticed during COVID, actually. I'd already seen the ad for their Music of the Sphere tour. It was in an article, and during that article they described it. They said they were not going to tour at that time until they could work out how to offer a carbon neutral concert. And I thought that was really interesting. What do they mean by a carbon neutral concert? That's not net zero, it's carbon neutral. Can I have the next slide? And more interestingly, by 2021, when I looked again, the information around the Coldplay tour had changed the terminology from carbon neutral to net zero, which got me even more interested. And of course, they added some bit more information. There's a really good sustainability plan on the website if you ever want to have a look. So they provide more details, 50% reduction on CO2 emissions. Okay, so if you're not in this area of work, what does CO2e mean? I know what CO2 probably is by now, but what does the E mean? Benchmarked on 2016-17 tour levels. Well, what does that mean, benchmarked on? So there are a whole series of things there, from the change from carbon neutral to net zero in terms of describing the tour, to just that use of, simple terms. They're not so simple. CO2e, benchmarking. We really need to dig a bit deeper to understand what all this means. Can I have the next slide? And so what I'd started to do was just to compile a list of the terminology that I was coming across, and you may well have seen at least some of it, and start to think about, well, how do we define all of these things? And obviously we've just talked about carbon neutral and net zero, and wonder, well, what's the difference between those two? Well, hang on, I'm going to give you that in a minute. But there are other terms that are quite frequently used, like net positive. What does that mean? Carbon negative. And how does that differ from carbon positive? The other day I looked at, I was looking at a course, I think it was, which was a leadership course, a carbon positive leadership course. And I thought, what on earth are they going to be talking about on this carbon positive leadership course? Was it about the way the course was run and how it was run? Or was it about the content? And what does carbon positive actually mean? And do they really understand what it means? Because carbon positive means that you're pumping carbon into the atmosphere. So whatever your activity is, you are putting out carbon. Carbon negative, it's almost counterintuitive, means that you are pumping out or taking out carbon from the atmosphere. So what did that leadership course, what did they really mean by that? Another one, carbon offsetting, and I'll be devoting a bit of this talk to explaining what that is and what the sort of benefits and pitfalls are. But what is carbon offsetting? And then another term, carbon insetting. Is that the same thing? Is there a difference? Eco-balancing, another term that's quite often used in terms of replacing the term offsetting. It's in there somewhere with this idea, which is about matching, carbon emissions with the amount that you do to take out the carbon emissions from the environment. But what exactly is it? And is it the same, just another term, eco-balancing, as carbon offsetting, or is it something different? Carbon extraction and reduction, how does that differ from carbon insetting or carbon offsetting or eco-balancing? There must be some difference, but what is it? Mitigation, a term that's often used. We're going to chop down all of these trees in the city, but we'll mitigate that by planting some new, younger trees. Well, what are you doing there? Mitigation tends to imply compensation. Is it equal compensation, those actions? Or is it just a token gesture to say, well, we are mitigating our actions here by doing something else? And how valid is that something else? Sequestration, another term that's come over obviously from science. That's about how much CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere, either by natural means, the carbon dioxide absorbed by trees, or salt marshes, or just grassland, as well as more tech methods, which again I'll mention a little bit later. So we have new technologies that can take carbon out of the atmosphere or sequester that carbon. Drawdown is to do with how we maintain our agriculture, and that's a term that sort of popped up a year or two ago but seems to have gone quiet. So we have all of this terminology, and you may well have seen other language as well. And I have no doubt that there will be new terms popping up on the horizon as we go along. So I'm going to make some attempt to explain some of that terminology, but obviously, keep an eye out for the new stuff. And really, I'd like to emphasize that we should, before we embark on anything, just make sure that we do understand what it all means. Next slide. And to set the scene, I thought it was worth going back to where our net zero targets are coming from, that language. So if you haven't already looked at it or you're not familiar with it, in the UK, what's setting the scene, what's setting the targets is the UK Climate Change Act 2008, which was amended in 2019. Obviously, that's not the start because it's UN protocols that actually set the overall global scene, but this funnels down into our own legislation via the UK Climate Change Act. And I thought I've just extracted a few little bits here because I thought these were interesting and very relevant to what I'm doing today. The first of these, again, talks about climate change. The Climate Change Act in 2008 was looking at not just CO2, but greenhouse gas emissions in total. So what are they? By 80% from 1990 levels by 2050. Now that 80% has been updated by the 2019 amendment to 100%. But the point remains, people often think that the 2050 net zero target is about reducing us down to net zero emissions, full stop. It's not. It's actually reducing us down to those levels of emissions that were current in 1990. So there's one thing to clarify. We need to understand, so what were those 1990 level emissions? And we can find that out. But to be clear that, we're not getting rid of it altogether. We're trying to get back to the level of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, which cause the climate change, to 1990 levels. So I think, you know, hoping that that sort of clarifies one thing. You may not have even thought about it. The next point that I've just included in this slide is a little extract from the Act, which again includes some terminology which I think it's worth unpicking. So I'm just going to have to put my glasses up for this one. Any emissions would be balanced by schemes to offset, there's that word, offset, that was in my list, an equivalent amount of greenhouse gases. So what are they? What's included in that? From the atmosphere, such as planting trees. I think we're all familiar with schemes to plant trees, or using technology like carbon capture and storage, which perhaps we're less familiar with. So again, in the Climate Change Act, there is terminology there that we need to unpick. So next slide. The first thing is that that Act talks about net zero. It doesn't talk about carbon neutral. So let's just see what the difference between the two are. Let's see what that coffee, that carbon neutral coffee, was all about. So carbon neutral refers to a policy of not increasing carbon emissions and of achieving carbon reduction through offsets. Whereas net zero carbon means making changes to reduce carbon emissions to the lowest amount of offset, and offsetting as a last resort. And that is absolutely key, because really what we're saying with carbon neutral, and it's why Coldplay moved from carbon neutral to net zero, is that we're probably not going to do that much to actually ourselves reduce our carbon emissions. What we are going to do is pay to have carbon reductions made via other means through offsetting. And there's been a huge amount of criticism involved in that approach, because what it essentially says is, well, I'm going to buy my way out of trouble. I don't have to do very much because I can rely on these offsets to actually reduce my carbon emissions, to offset any carbon emissions that I make through my tour or through my event or whatever it is, which is very different from saying that I'm going to do everything possible within my organization, my event, to reduce my own carbon emissions and to the lowest amount I possibly can. And then I will only use offsetting, paying for another scheme to mop up the rest as a last resort. So those two things are fundamental. It's why the Act talks about not net zero, but it also includes offsetting in there, because there is a big difference between just paying for something and not doing much to reduce your own emissions, and the net zero approach, which is really looking at your whole operational as well as supply chain to see what you can do yourselves to reduce those emissions. That's a really important difference. So hold that. Next slide. And then it talks about greenhouse gases. Now, you know, on the one hand, we talk about CO2. On the other hand, you'll see reference to greenhouse gases. So I just thought it would be worth putting up a slide which just says, well, these are the main greenhouse gases. So CO2, of course, is in there. It's a big one, but so too is methane. Methane comes from agricultural practice, from livestock, and it's a pretty big contributor to the overall greenhouse gas problem. It also, of course, comes from landfill sites. We're now beginning to draw off methane to use it as another energy source, but methane is generated really from decomposing organic matter, whether it's in the stomach of a cow or whether it's in a landfill site. So it can come from multiple sources, but mainly the biggest emitter into the atmosphere is from agriculture, from the food that we eat, basically. The third one is nitrous oxide. Now, we know nitrous oxide probably from those little silver canisters that are left lying around at the end of festivals and in the countryside. Pretty much anywhere you can come across these. But actually, nitrous oxide, the biggest emitter of nitrous oxide, is again agriculture, it's fertilizers. It's the fertilizers used in agriculture. So that's another big source. Hydrofluorocarbons are to do with things like refrigeration, the gases used in refrigeration, and also in aerosols. And we really got to grips with that. There was some legislation which put a limit on the use and to try and eradicate actually hydrofluorocarbons, the bad ones. And that's been largely successful. So we don't have so much concerns about that. They used to contribute to the opening up of the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer. So we've got to grips with that. And the other bad one, which forms part of our greenhouse gas group, are particulates. And these particulates are things like those bits that come out of the emissions from vehicles. So there might be the heavy metals, the lead that's included in petrol and diesel to make it run more smoothly, the engine run more smoothly. All of those other things, or if we're burning stuff, just the carbon matter, the tiny little particulates that float into the atmosphere. So this actually, this list, there are some other smaller contributors, but these are the main greenhouse gases. And these are the E, the remaining ones that I mentioned in this list are the E, which is added on to CO2. So when we talk about CO2 emissions, we now add a little E. We're actually adding these other things which make up the greenhouse gases, other emitters, in other words. Next slide, please. Which then takes me on, there you can see it, the CO2e, to measuring our carbon footprint. So if we're going to do what the Climate Change Act wants us to do, which is to reduce our emissions by 100%, benchmarked on 1990 levels, we actually need to understand what those emissions are. Where are we currently? Which means that we need to measure our carbon footprint. So you may well be familiar with or come across the whole process of measuring carbon footprint, measuring that CO2e. And that is related to how we benchmark, set the level for where we are now. So there's another piece of terminology related to the Climate Change Act. We've got a benchmark, nationally, globally, on 1990 levels. Actually, that's the UK benchmark. But as an organisation or an event, to understand how we actually also contribute to that, we need to understand what our own carbon footprint is. And that's where we have to measure our carbon footprint. Other terms involved in that, embodied carbon. Now, these are less frequently used, but they are increasingly. I see them quite a bit now, whereas I never saw them in general articles or terms before. So embodied carbon, what does that mean? Well, that is the carbon that's used in the manufacture, usually, of goods, articles, things that we actually use, and I'll keep it in context, at our events. So for example, if you're a camping festival, manufacture of those tents that your audience bring with you will have embodied carbon. So energy sources, usually from fossil fuel, will have been used to not only make the tent, but make those materials for the tent. They're mainly plastic, for example. So creating those materials to then make the tent all involves energy usage, which is still mostly from fossil fuels. So in the manufacturing process, we have embodied carbon into the making of those tents. The next group of terms and involved in measuring carbon footprint are scope 1, 2, and 3. Again, a few years ago, you'd never have seen this. Now, I see it mentioned quite a lot. Oh, well, we're focusing on our scope 1, nothing we can do about scope 3. Okay, fair enough. What does that mean? Well, I put some little definitions down. Scope 1, if you're an event or a festival, all those direct emissions from the sources either owned or controlled by the event or the organization. So what that means is you're on site or you're at your venue, any fuel you used, which is not electricity, which is emissions from fossil fuels, will be counted, because if you weren't staging the event at the venue or on site, there wouldn't be any emissions, just wouldn't happen. So those are scope 1, directly related to what you're doing. Then there's scope 2, indirect emissions. This is where you perhaps are on grid. If you're an outdoor event, or if you're a venue, you're on the grid. So you're using electricity. So these emissions are indirect because they are created further down the supply chain line when that electricity is produced, again, very often from fossil fuels. Not totally. You can, of course, get green energy from the grid now as well. But any scope 2 emissions will be measured from those where you're not obtaining green energy and that electricity is from fossil fuels, indirect emissions. Scope 3, which is all the other emissions associated with the organization's activities, mainly through the supply chain, but for our business, quite a lot of those emissions will come from travel and transport, both from getting stuff on site, but also things like audience travel, touring travel, carting kit around the world or across country. And scope 3 really are the hardest to deal with in many ways, because we don't have direct control over it. We have to use influence in many respects, or we could do it contractually to try and reduce those scope 3 emissions. Next slide. And as I mentioned, it's travel and transport which are the biggest ones creating those scope 3 emissions for our industry. And as I said, it's difficult because to make real reductions, we have to be able to influence change in behaviours without being able to directly control it. And this is where the whole offsetting thing, has found an opening, because if you can't directly control something, and maybe you can't, your influence is limited, how are you going to mitigate, there's that word, compensate, mitigate, against your scope 3 emissions associated with your event, which are to do with travel? How are you going to do that? Well, up until recently, the only way considered was through offsetting, which takes us to next phase of this presentation. So I want to now talk a little bit about the whole issue around offsetting. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're in what I would call the era of carbon offsetting 2.0. We may be entering 3.0, but that's by the by for this one. Carbon offsetting 1.0 started in the 1990s. It was all to do with corporate social responsibility. How could companies demonstrate they were doing something about their effect on the climate? And lo and behold, this whole idea of offsetting took hold, And we had all sorts of schemes developed in the 1990s, usually, bronze, silver, gold, some far off land. People were planting trees or doing something which they told you was offsetting your carbon emissions. It fell into disrepute because often those schemes either didn't exist, they didn't do what they said they were going to do, nobody actually knew what they were doing, or they were even causing more harm, more damage than they were designed for. So they weren't actually benefiting anybody. So carbon offsetting, to go back to our legislation, is the process of finding another means of reducing the carbon emissions, generally because you can't actually do it yourselves. And if we're going down the net zero route, you will have tried everything you possibly can, but there may still be some emissions that you can't do anything about. So carbon offsetting has been a way that organizations have found to actually mop up, if you like, to say, right, our carbon emissions were so much, we've done as much as we can to reduce them down to this, through the process, usually of planting trees, but some other schemes more recently, we've been able to reduce those carbon emissions still further. That's the thinking behind it. Carbon offsetting 2.0 sort of has claimed that now there's much more scientific validity, it's auditable, it has legitimacy, and so it's a better version of carbon offsetting 1.0. There are question marks, though, when these schemes are, set in other countries, usually the Far East or South America or somewhere where there are problems, a distant land, let's call it that. There are some criticisms about just the purpose of this, what's the intention behind it, the motivation for doing it in the Far East, whereas, not in the UK, for example, and this notion of philanthropic capitalism, which is distasteful to some. So that's trying to use these schemes to actually secure influence in the region. Other arguments for carbon offsetting, which are perhaps not well grounded, everyone's doing it, so we may as well go along that route. And yes, a lot of big organizations do carbon offsetting. That's true. Criticisms, well, it's easy. You just pay your money. There's no need to change behaviors, no need to do anything much within the organization. You're just buying your way out of trouble. You're buying carbon neutrality. And when we go down that route, you're very open to the criticism of greenwashing. We are carbon neutral. We're even net zero, but be careful on what schemes you choose and whether you're open to the greenwashing criticism. Because, next slide, those schemes, and we're beginning to realize the limitations, have to date often included tree planting. Now, I want to start this because I've had people come back to me and say, oh, you've been criticizing planting trees. I'm not criticizing planting trees. There's absolutely nothing wrong with planting trees. In fact, it's a really good thing to do in my book. It's a cheap way of helping to deal with pollution. It's good for our well-being. The science shows that. But it's not going to happen now. And it's not going to happen in 10 years' time. It's not going to make a real immediate difference. And that's the point. But it is legacy planting. It will make a difference in the future. So what you're doing, if you're working with tree planting schemes, you're not actually offsetting today, you're legacy planting for the future. And I think that's a really, really important thing to understand. The problem is that this is quite a way down the future, and the science tells us we don't have that much time. So we've got to not only plant trees, but we've got to look at other things as well. Just a little bit more on the tree planting thing, because I would think it's, can I have the next slide? It's worth just making, you know, the point clear. As I said, absolutely nothing wrong. It is legacy. But to have tree planting as an offsetting scheme assumes that there's real-time compensation. And the next slide will show you how there isn't real-time compensation. You plant a sapling today, it is not going to do much for a number of years. And I've taken this example of the amount of carbon generated by the UK live music. The last report that I looked at, okay, it's a little bit old, but it gives you some measures, some measurement for scale. So in the Show Must Go On report, great report, 2019, there is a much newer version. It said that we generated, as an industry, live music industry, 28,500 tonnes of carbon in 2018. Now, 28,500 tonnes of carbon sounds a lot, but actually it's not that huge when you compare it to other industries. Nonetheless, it is still contributing to climate change. It's still something we have to do something about. But my argument about the real-time effect of planting trees is based on how much a new tree can actually do something about that generation of carbon in a short scale. It can't, you know, 28,500 tonnes in 2018. Looking at data from the Grantham Institute, which is based at Imperial College London, if you just stick to the UK, a typical UK broadleaf can absorb 21 kilograms per year or 1 tonne of CO2 over 100 years. This is not real-time compensation or offsetting. 1 acre of new forest will capture 2.5 tonnes of carbon annually. So that's an awful lot of acres we've got to plant to even start to get into that 28,500 tonnes. And we're doing this year on year, don't forget. You know, we're not just generating 28,500, then we can wait for those trees to catch up. It's year on year we're pumping this stuff out. 1 young tree, and that's the saplings that we often see in the picture, those little saplings, perhaps can deal with 6 kilograms per year. They only really start to motor after about 10 years of growth. And there are other arguments about monocultures and the effect of intensive tree planting on wildlife, and I won't go into those now. But there's some of the data which proves once and for all that, you know, this is not real time. Planting trees is not going to help us today or even tomorrow. It might in 10 years' time, those trees. So we've got to do something else. And the other thing is that you have to watch, if you are going down the legacy tree planting route, that there is some mechanism for those trees to be looked after. Locally, we had an incident, trees planted, I think it was late 2019. We had a drought during the COVID 3 months from March to June in 2020. 60,000 tree saplings died. End of story. Trees do die. They died on a massive scale because nobody was looking after them. Nobody actually watered them during an intense drought. So it's also important, if you're going down the tree legacy planting route, to see what the scheme offers in terms of maintenance and looking after those trees afterwards. Okay, next slide. But we can do other things. We can flip that, and if we want to actually make a difference, and that making a difference is, let's hold things to where we are, let's not make things worse, we could support schemes to stop cutting trees down. So instead of planting new trees that will take some years to mature and do the job, we could actually support schemes that stop tree cutting. Because if we cut trees down, we are just taking away a mechanism which is actually extracting carbon from our environment. So we're contributing to the problem simply by cutting them down. It's estimated that between 3.5 to 7 billion trees are cut down globally every year, which is quite shocking. That's actually really going to add to the problem. So, you know, why not invest in the scheme? And there are schemes out there to stop cutting trees down, to actually stop increasing the problem. But beyond that, next slide, there are now emerging a host of other solutions that we should be looking at more carefully. One, which is, you know, the protection of nature based on what we call natural capital. And this is about, again, protecting what we already have. So let's put greater value through natural capital. Let's put greater economic value on what we already have. And a good example of that is actually already established. So where, for example, festivals or events are staged in parkland, where you have some, you know, important trees, into the contract, there are fines and penalties for damaging those trees. You're effectively putting a value on the preservation of that tree, a monetary value. And we see that in contracts. So, you know, you damage a branch of an old important tree, it could be worth a £30,000 fine, for example. We see that in practice, and we also see a lot of measures these days to not only protect the tree, but also the roots around the tree. Examples of natural capital through monetary means. We could choose offsetting projects, and there are, with much more immediate effect than legacy tree planting. So, for example, solar panels, solar arrays, wind panels, investment in hydro or investment in wave power. There's lots of different power generation schemes that are beginning to emerge, which provide opportunities for offsetting. Do they all have to be in far-flung countries? Might be legitimate if you're a global corporation operating around the world, but if you're more nationally based, why not looking at more local projects? And that's where the whole insetting comes in. It's offsetting, but locally, either within your organization, so you might be a venue, there's actually put solar panels on the roof, or within the local community, you know, investing in insetting for a school, for example, to put solar panels on its roof. Replace fossil fuel burning by using clean energy. Move from ordinary electricity, if you're on the grid, to green energy sources, grid sources, or even greener sources which are beginning to be tested and used on site. And I know a number of events are testing these and using these, everything from biofuels to HVO. You know, hydrogen is the next one, isn't it? We've got electricity, electric vehicles, but hydrogen is the next one. Reduce land impacts. Be careful of how we treat the land that we stage our events on. You know, we do need to protect the ecology of that as well. Drawdown tells us that, you know, even grassland draws down CO2 as well. So protect that land as much as possible. And then some would argue for things like rights-based nature protection, which is a whole different area. And I haven't really seen too many schemes that involve that. But it's basically giving legislative rights based on, you know, protecting nature, giving legislative rights to nature, in other words. But what is coming on the scene, and we're beginning to see more and more of, are the big tech solutions. They've actually been, along with that horrible reinvestment in fossil fuels, they are talked about by government as well. And these involve big schemes to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere by capturing that carbon. And the science is there to do that. And we're storing, sequestering that carbon in things like mines or under the ocean and various other schemes. So it is possible now to actually invest in offsetting schemes which are purely focused on reduction through carbon capture, where not only are we balancing, removing as much as we put in, but we're going further. We're actually taking more out than we put in through carbon capture schemes. And then, of course, further rights-based natural capital, preserving things like salt marshes. It's not just about preserving trees, it's preserving those habitats, which we now understand a lot more are very effective carbon sequesters as well. Next slide. Just a quick reference, I came across this week, not in our industry, but they are one of the biggest food producers globally. Nestle have seen the light. They're moving away from investing in carbon offsets to invest in their own programs and practices to help reduce GHG emissions. What they seem to be saying there is within the organization and through the supply chain, they are going to be taking a net zero approach, doing everything they can before offsetting to actually reduce the carbon emissions. Our net zero roadmap does not rely on offsets. We focus on GHG emission reduction and removals within our value chain to reach our net zero ambition. So again, moving away from the carbon neutral terminology, making it clear that actually you are going to do everything you can to reduce your emissions, and only then look at offsetting using the net zero approach. Final slide. So there's no doubt about it. I think, the science agrees, we all understand we have got to reduce those greenhouse gases, the carbon, the methane, but what's in our power, carbon, particularly now. We can't hang around. We can't wait 10, 50, 100 years. So what can we do? Well, to summarize, we move from carbon neutral, if that's where we're at currently, or if we're not, we certainly adopt a net zero approach, reduce everything that we can to make it better. Benchmark, you need to know where you are now. So find out the level of your current emissions by benchmarking your CO2e. Focus on reduction and removal. Whatever schemes that you develop, look at local schemes, particularly if you are UK based, so that you've got some auditable scheme you can actually go and have a look at. Obviously, different matter if you're corporate global. But if you aren't, there are auditable schemes you can go and have a look at. You can see the results of what you've actually invested in the offset in. But that should focus on reduction and removal. We're not just trying to balance anymore, get down to, we've taken out as much as we put in. We want to do more than that. We want to take out more. Find schemes where we take out more than just what we've added, because that's actually what we've got to do. We've got to take out more than we're putting in. Otherwise, we have no hope of getting back to 1990 levels. And the final point is, please plant trees, but remember its legacy. It's not going to have an effect today. That's it.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We've got, what's the time? We've got about 10 minutes for questions, if anyone has any. I know I've got one, so I might just kick it off with.
Sure.
What are some really simple things that any ordinary person can do? I've seen lots of things about potentially like changing your bank. Things like that anyone could do to help be more sustainable.
I think you have to look at, if we're talking about the individual rather than, organizations, look at your lifestyle. So how much do you use your car if you've got a car? And is it necessary to do it? I know, and it was prompted from COVID. I used to use my car to pop to the local shops, and I'm working in this industry. I don't do that anymore. I always walk. I make the time to do the walk. If I have to have a meeting in London, I never drove, I always catch the train, but I used to use the tube. I always walk that extra mile. Anything to, cut down on those aspects to do with travel, but you can look at the food you eat. I mentioned that agriculture produces a greenhouse gas, methane, that comes from meat products. You don't have to eliminate meat altogether. I think I would find it really difficult, but there's no doubt that I eat far, far less meat now than I used to. I make a point of, for me, it's 5 days at least of not eating meat. So, it's small things like that. It's obviously turning lights off when you don't need it, notching down the central heating. Well, I think we've all been driven by energy prices to do that anyway, which will help, on the other hand. So, think about the sorts of things you're buying. I know I'm one of the, could be seen as one of those stroppy women who goes into the supermarket, removes all the plastic packaging and dumps it on the checkout. I don't need it. Why is it there? We're just proliferating, plastic. That's embodied carbon in the making of that plastic, as well as the waste of that plastic. So there are lots of things, if you start to think about it, small changes, that you can make, which will all make a difference. And these can roll through, obviously, on a much bigger scale with organisations, with events, with venues.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, actually. Lindsay says, you talked about tree planting as a carbon offset or better supporting causes that are working towards reducing deforestation. Are there any similar schemes that you're aware of that talk about blue carbon? You mentioned salt marshes and supporting seagrass plantations or similar, which are more effective carbon sink than trees.
Yes, again, we're gradually becoming aware of these carbon sinks, which are more effective. I don't know of any schemes yet, but I'm sure there are some schemes. I'd have to look it up, but I can't tell you offhand, I'm afraid, what they are. But yeah, another one is peat bogs. We've been happily using peat now. Anybody who's got a garden or keen on plants, the horticultural industry has been, using peat for many, many years. We suddenly realise that's a big sequester of carbon. It holds in ancient carbon as well, and we've got to stop it. So another investment that could be used as an offset.
Great. Arash asks, you mentioned carbon neutral refers to not increasing carbon emissions, but from when?
No, I need to understand this. So are we talking about carbon neutral is where you are, trying to balance out your emissions by using a scheme which will take those emissions out. And people don't tend to think about when. The legislation does. It benchmarks the reductions we have to make to 1990 levels. Different countries, interestingly, benchmark different years. We benchmark 1990. I think the States benchmark something like 2016. So, it's a bit problematic because if we're looking across countries, we're not comparing like with like at all. And I think European countries are similar. They have different benchmarks. That basic year where you've measured your emissions and now you're looking at everything on top of that has to go. So carbon neutral for the organisation, I'm not sure I really understand the question, actually. I can talk about it more generally. And if you want to come back and perhaps explain a little bit more.
Carol Scott, who is our chair of Live Green from TikTok, has a question. Carol, do you want to...
I have a question, Teresa. We've only gone back to 2019 as our baseline to our emissions. So in order for us to create a path to net zero, we can't really go back to 1990 because we don't have anything. how would we create a path to net zero then if we've only gone back to 2000?
It's a very interesting question, and the more I look into this, I mentioned that different countries have different benchmark years, but I don't think that has been tested legislatively. We've got this piece of legislation that says we should be working to 1990 levels, but then, how possible is that for individual organizations if you've set your benchmark because it's the first time you've been able to measure where you're at? Did you exist at that point in 1990 as an organization? What were the levels? How would you calculate? There's a lot of unknowns in that. This is where it's problem. And what happens, if you are benchmarking to 2019 and but the legislation is saying 1990 as a UK, well, what happens legislatively? Lots and lots of grey areas. I think that you have benchmarked, which is the right thing to do, 2019. And that you go forward from there and you reduce as much as you possibly can based on those. That's probably the best you can do. The problem for many organisations still, I think, is that they don't have any benchmarks. They don't really know their starting point. But I think it's a really good question, and I think it's quite a muddy area.
All right, okay, I understand that. My other question is when the government says that the country is going to be net zero by 2050, are they only talking about the things that the government control, i.e. like government buildings, the army, the navy, etc., or are they making assumptions for all of us in business? Do you know the answer to that?
I can't be definitive, but my reading of that act is they are making assumptions for all of us. There's no point in having a 2050, or in Scotland, of course, it's 2045 net zero target. There's no point in having it for some industries and not others, because this is a problem that affects everybody. Oops, sorry. So my reading is that the expectation is that it filters down to everybody, every organisation, every industry, because otherwise, it's pretty meaningless to say that government reaches 2050 but nobody else is. What good is that actually going to do? But yeah, so that's my reading of that piece of legislation.
Thank you very, very much. The presentation has been amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Teresa. We've got about 1 minute left. There's a quite good chat going on about reusable cups and cups that we use. At Live Green, we're doing a piece of research actually to try and work out what is the best cup to use in venues, whether that is a reusable plastic cup, paper cups. We're trying to work it out. What are your thoughts, Teresa, on cups in venues? Because I know we've got quite a lot of venues here. We know that they've been tested on shows by AMG for like the likes of like Holly Humberstone. I think SSE up in Scotland has trialled them as well. Do you know anything further there?
So we did a study, but this is a few years ago, and I think this is one of the issues. We have to keep doing these studies and bits of research because things are changing all the time. So if I use some of the language that I've used in the presentation, the study we did, the most beneficial for the environment cup was thought to be the reusable one, was initially the aluminium cup. But then people realized, well, what about the embodied carbon? That is the carbon from making that, which of course is the heaviest use of carbon in the making. It lasts the longest. So it's the best resource in terms of a cup which you use, but actually the embodied carbon rules all of that out. So the study we did was actually looking at the PET, that plastic, still the best one. If you got 8 uses, which was an average, 8 times use out of it, that actually was better than anything currently. But we've got much more recently, new innovations on paper cups. You know, they were heavily coated in plastic, which meant cross-contamination of waste. You couldn't deal with it. Hundreds of other issues. But paper, I think the developments in paper cups are coming along quite a bit. But I think, you know, we're still probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, because our study is a few years ago now, that we came out with, it was still the best option at the time to use plastic reusable cups. Now, we've also got bioplastic in there. What you don't want to do is have plastic and bioplastic, because that creates a huge waste cross-contamination problem. So you stick to one. Bioplastic is pretty good, but perhaps not as compostable as people like to think. I'm sorry, I'm going into a million issues because it's not clear cut again. That was what we came out with, but it is a few years ago. And I think any new study, we have to keep doing these studies because things are changing and improving all the time.
Yeah, well, hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have more of a clear answer soon with our piece of research we're doing at the moment with Julie's bicycle. So
that'd be great. Yeah, because that will tell us where we are now. And then, of course, you know, that will prompt more changes, which would be good as well.
Exactly. I'm aware we have slightly run over, so thanks for sticking around. If you're okay to take one more question, Teresa.
Sure. Yeah, I'm good.
It's on Luigi asks, as festival production, when renting HVO generators, which I know is a big topic at the moment, is that also considered within scope 2 emissions, as they are still emissions from purchased energy?
If it's on site, and we're having this debate internally, actually, we're currently looking at it as a scope 1, because you wouldn't be using that HVO, you wouldn't be using that generator if there wasn't an event. So if that's the case, then it's a direct result of the event, and it would fall into scope 1.
Perfect, thank you. And then just to finish it off, Nikki has asked, do you know of any other artists that are actively trying to reduce tour emissions? So we know of Coldplay, we know of Bring Me the Horizon, we know of Holly Humberstone. Do you know of any other artists that come to mind that are active?
Well, Massive Attack being quite, you know, prompted the that study to look at how the music industry could do more. I'm trying to think of the centre, its name escapes me, but there was, you know, a couple of years ago that was quite big. That seems to have died down a little bit, but I think there's a big project that's come out of that, which I can't remember what it's called.
Sorry, I'll put you on the spot there.
Yeah. But you know, let's not forget that some of these go back, you know, there's some artists, unsung artists now in the, was it Placebo, late 1990s, early 2000, who were talking about it then. So we've got, you know, 1975 have done made some statements on it, Billie Eilish and the sort of ban on plastic water bottles. As for the touring, nothing on the scale, I don't think, of Coldplay, because that is a global tour, but obviously Bring Me the Horizon. Bon Jovi have done a little bit. Yeah, those are the names that are the top of my head. There's probably others that I can't think of at the moment.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll see lots more artists joining the kind of the fight to be more sustainable across touring going forwards. But no, thank you so much, Teresa. That was really interesting. I think it's great to start with these kind of basics of just understanding the terminology, and I know I learned a lot from your presentation, so thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining. We will have another live talks in a couple of months, so keep an eye out. But yeah, that's it from us today. Thank you so much, Teresa, again, for your brilliant
pleasure. And thanks to everyone for listening and joining. Really important that you do.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.